September 1945. A 22-year-old Japanese nurse named Haruka Tanaka stood in an American prisoner of war camp, her hands trembling as they held a bar of chocolate. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto the brown wrapper, staining it with salt water and shame. She was not crying because she had been tortured. She was crying because the enemy had just given her a Christmas gift. 247 Japanese women had stepped off a transport ship in San Francisco Bay 3 months earlier, expecting death and degradation. Instead, they had been given hot showers, roast chicken dinners, and soldiers who called them ma'am, and opened doors like they were ladies at a church social, not defeated enemies of a brutal war. What happened next would shatter everything these women believed about honor, about sacrifice, about who the real monsters were in this world. This is not a story about war. This is a story about the most dangerous weapon America possessed in 1945. Not the atomic bomb, not the vast fleets that controlled the Pacific, not the endless factories that churned out tanks and planes and ships faster than the enemy could sink them. The most dangerous weapon was something simpler. Something that would break these 247 women more completely than any torture ever could. Kindness. 2 weeks before the transport ship docked in San Francisco Bay, a Japanese propaganda officer had gathered the women on the deck of a dying warship. The man's uniform was crisp despite the heat, despite the certain knowledge that Japan had lost the war, despite everything crumbling around them like ash in the wind. He read from a booklet printed on cheap paper, the ink already fading in the salt air. "American soldiers are demons with no souls," he told them. His voice carried across the deck, flat and mechanical, as if he were reading a recipe instead of a death sentence. "They will strip you of your dignity. They will make you wish you had died in battle. They will do things to you that no honorable Japanese woman should ever have to endure." He showed them photographs, crude drawings, instruments that looked like they belonged in a medieval torture chamber, not a modern prisoner of war camp. "Death is mercy compared to American captivity," he said. Haruka had listened to every word. She had believed every syllable. And that night, while the other women slept in the cramped hole below deck, she had used a needle to sew a small pocket into the lining of her torn uniform. Inside that pocket, she had placed a single pill, cyanide given to her by a sympathetic officer who understood that some fates were worse than death. She would not let them torture her. She would die, with honor die as a Japanese woman should, rather than face whatever horrors awaited her on American soil. The morning of September 12th dawned cold and gray. Fog covered San Francisco Bay like a burial shroud, turning the world into nothing but shades of white and darker white. The transport ship cut through the water slowly, its engines groaning with exhaustion, as if the vessel itself wanted nothing more than to rest after years of war. On the deck, 247 women stood in tight clusters. Their hands gripped the metal rails with white knuckles. Their eyes were wide pupils dilated with a terror so profound it had become almost familiar, like an old friend they had learned to live with. Most were young, between 18 and 30 years old. They had served as nurses, radio operators, translators, and clerks for the Imperial Japanese Army across the vast expanse of the Pacific Theater. They had worked in field hospitals in the Philippines, in communication centers in Okinawa, in administrative offices from Burma to the Solomon Islands. Now they wore torn uniforms, the fabric stained with salt water and desperation. Their hair was matted unwashed for weeks aboard the crowded ship. Their faces were hollow cheekbones, sharp beneath skin stretched too tight over bone. The voyage had offered little food, less water, and no hope whatsoever. Some clutched small bags containing everything they owned in the world: a photograph, a letter, a small charm their mother had given them before they left home, back when leaving home felt like an adventure instead of a death sentence. Others had nothing at all. They stood empty-handed, empty-hearted, waiting for whatever came next with the resignation of people who had already died inside. The smell of salt water mixed with diesel fuel filled the air. Seagulls cried overhead, circling the ship like scavengers waiting for carrion. Their calls sounded almost mocking to the women below, as if even the birds knew what fate awaited them on American shores. Through the fog, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, darker gray against lighter gray. Then the shape resolved itself into something impossible, something that made several women gasp out loud. The Golden Gate Bridge rose from the mist like a vision from another world. Red towers climbed toward the sky, taller than any building in Tokyo, taller than anything most of these women had ever seen. Cables swooped between the towers in perfect mathematical curves, graceful and strong, and utterly untouched by war. The women stared in silence. None of them could speak. None of them could process what they were seeing. In Japan, every bridge had been bombed to rubble. Every structure of significance had been reduced to twisted metal and broken concrete. The cities they had left behind were landscapes of destruction, places where nothing stood higher than a man, unless that man was standing on a pile of debris that had once been someone's home. But here was a bridge that seemed to touch the sky. Perfect, pristine, impossible. They will kill us when we land. The whisper came from Haruka's left. The speaker was a woman named Akemi Sato, 26 years old, a radio operator who had served in the Philippines. Her voice trembled as she spoke, barely audible above the sound of the ship's engines and the crying gulls. Haruka did not answer. She could not answer. Her throat was too tight, her mouth too dry. Her hand moved unconsciously to her uniform, feeling for the small pocket she had sewn there, feeling for the pill that promised escape from whatever horrors awaited them on shore. Beside Akemi stood Reiko Yamamoto, the oldest woman in their group at 38, a widow whose husband had died at Guadalcanal 3 years earlier, a mother of 2 children, ages 8 and 10, who were living with their grandparents in what remained of Tokyo. Reiko's hand was in her pocket too, but she was not reaching for poison. She was touching a photograph worn soft at the edges from constant handling. 2 small faces stared out from that photograph, their eyes hollow even before the worst of the starvation had begun. Their smiles forced for a camera they did not understand. Would she ever see them again? Would they even recognize her if she did? The ship's horn blasted 3 times. The sound was deep and mournful, like the call of some enormous dying animal. The women flinched as one, their bodies tensing, preparing for whatever came next. The ship began its final approach to the military pier. Through the thinning fog, shapes appeared on the dock below. Human shapes, men in American uniforms. The women pressed closer to the rails, drawn by a horrible fascination, unable to look away from the men who would be their executioners, their torturers, their final memory before death, or worse than death. But something was wrong. The soldiers below were not standing at attention. They were not holding their rifles at the ready. They were not screaming orders or making threatening gestures toward the ship. They were just standing there, casually, talking among themselves. One soldier lit a cigarette. Another laughed at something a friend had said. A third was reading what looked like a letter from home, his face soft with some private memory. They looked bored. They looked like men waiting for a bus, not executioners, but preparing to receive a shipload of enemy prisoners. Haruka's mind could not process this information. It did not match anything she had been told. It did not fit with the photographs the propaganda officer had shown them, the stories of American savagery and cruelty. And then something happened that made time stop. One of the soldiers looked up at the ship. He was young, no older than 20, with a face that still carried the softness of boyhood beneath his military cap. He saw the women lining the rail staring down at him with wide, terrified eyes. And he waved, not a grand gesture, not a mocking salute, just a simple wave, casual and almost friendly, like a neighbor greeting another neighbor across a fence on a summer evening. Haruka grabbed Akemi's arm so hard, her fingernails dug into the other woman's skin. "Did you see that?" Her voice came out as a harsh whisper. He waved at us. Akemi's jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords beneath her skin. "Maybe it is a trick, to make us feel safe before." She did not finish the sentence. Neither of them wanted to imagine what came after before. The gangway lowered with a metallic clang that echoed across the water. American officers appeared at the top of the ramp, clipboards in hand, calling out orders in English that sounded harsh and guttural to ears accustomed to the softer rhythms of Japanese. Then a new figure appeared, a Japanese-American soldier, his uniform identical to the others except for the insignia that marked him as a translator. He was young, perhaps 25, with a face that looked strange to the women, both familiar and foreign at the same time. Japanese features, but an American bearing an American confidence in his stance. He spoke in their language, his accent carrying the peculiar flatness of someone who had learned Japanese from immigrant parents rather than in Japan itself. "You will exit the ship in single file. You will be processed, given medical examinations, and assigned quarters. No harm will come to you. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention." The women looked at each other with confusion in their eyes. Geneva Convention. None of them had heard those words before. They did not know what they meant. Was it a promise or a threat? A guarantee of safety? Or just another lie told by the victorious to the defeated? They began to move, slowly, reluctantly. Each step down the gangway felt like walking toward an execution, felt like the voluntary march to the gallows that every samurai story had taught them was the only honorable response to certain death. The wood creaked under their feet. The fog swirled around them, cold and damp against skin that had not felt clean in months. And below, the American soldiers waited, watching them descend with expressions that were not angry, not cruel, but something else entirely. Curious, almost gentle. Haruka was in the middle of the line. She counted her steps down the gangway. 43 steps from the ship to American soil. 43 steps between the world she knew and whatever came next. Her foot touched the pier. The wood was solid beneath her thin shoes, worn through at the soles from months of standing in field hospitals, from walking on coral beaches and jungle paths and the metal decks of dying ships. She expected to feel horror at this moment. She expected the touch of enemy soil to burn like acid, to freeze like ice, to announce itself with some physical manifestation of wrongness. Instead, she felt nothing but confusion, because the first soldier she passed, the young one who had waved from below, was looking at her with something in his eyes that she could not identify at first. It took her several long seconds to recognize the expression. Sympathy. The enemy felt sorry for her. Then he smiled. Not a cruel smile designed to mock her fear, not a triumphant smile from the victor to the vanquished. Just a smile, simple and human and utterly incomprehensible. He gestured toward a white building at the end of the pier. "This way, ma'am." "Ma'am." The enemy had just called her ma'am. Haruka's hand went to the pill in her pocket, her fingers closing around it through the fabric of her uniform. But she did not take it out. Not yet. She would wait. She would see what happened next. And if the torture began, if the degradation started, she would still have her escape. The women were led into the white building. It was clean, almost antiseptically, so smelling of disinfectant and something else, something floral that none of them could identify. The floors were polished to a shine. The walls were painted a soft cream color. Everything was bright and clean and ordered in a way that seemed impossible after months of dirt and chaos. Inside, more surprises waited. Female nurses, American women in crisp white uniforms, their hair neat beneath their caps, their faces calm and professional. They stood in a row waiting, and the Japanese women stopped in the doorway, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The Americans had sent women to process them. Not male guards who might abuse them, not cruel matrons who might take pleasure in their humiliation, but nurses. Professional medical staff who looked at them with the same clinical detachment they might give to any patient entering their care. The translator spoke again. "Please remove your uniforms and place them in these bags. You will be given clean clothing after your medical examination and shower." Panic rippled through the group like electricity through water. Remove their uniforms in front of strangers. Strip naked before the enemy. In Japan, modesty was not just a virtue. It was the foundation of civilization itself, the barrier between human beings and animals. To be seen undressed by strangers was a humiliation worse than many forms of death. But what choice did they have? Slowly, reluctantly, with trembling hands and faces burning with shame, the women began to undress. Some turned their backs, trying to hide themselves even as they removed their clothing. Others moved quickly, as if speed could somehow erase the shame of exposure. The American nurses moved among them with gentle efficiency. They offered no judgment, no mockery, no cruel laughter at the sight of enemy bodies laid bare. They simply handed each woman a white towel and pointed toward the next room. The medical examination was quick but thorough. The nurses checked for wounds, for infections, for signs of disease that might spread through the camp. They wrote notes on clipboards in their incomprehensible English script. They spoke softly to each other, their voices carrying a professionalism that felt bizarrely normal, as if this were just another day at a hospital instead of the processing of enemy prisoners. One nurse noticed Haruka's trembling hands. She placed her own hand gently on Haruka's shoulder, her touch warm through the thin towel. "It's okay." The words were in English. Haruka did not understand them, but she understood the tone. She understood the kindness in the woman's eyes. And that kindness broke something inside her. Something that had been holding back a dam of tears for months, for years, for the entire length of this terrible war. Haruka began to cry. Not quiet tears. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body, that bent her double with their force. The nurse's hand stayed on her shoulder through it all, steady and warm and impossibly kind. Then they were led to the showers. The room was large, tiled in white from floor to ceiling. Dozens of shower heads lined the walls, chrome fixtures gleaming under bright electric lights. Steam filled the air, warm and thick, carrying moisture that felt like salvation against skin parched by months of salt air and rationed water. The translator explained that they should wash thoroughly, that soap would be provided, that they should take as much time as they needed. Soap. The word hung in the air like a promise, almost too good to be true. The women stood frozen, staring at the small white bars that sat on shelves beneath each showerhead. They approached slowly, as if the soap might vanish like a mirage if they moved too quickly or believed too strongly that it was real. Haruka reached out and picked up a bar. It was smooth in her hand, heavier than she expected, solid and real and undeniably present. She brought it to her nose. The scent hit her like a physical blow. Lilacs. Her mother's garden in Osaka. Spring mornings before the war. Walking between rows of purple flowers while her little brother Kenji laughed and chased butterflies. The smell of earth after rain. The sound of her father's voice calling them in for breakfast. Everything beautiful that had existed in the world before fire fell from the sky and turned beauty to ash. She turned on the water with shaking hands. Hot water poured over her. Not lukewarm, not the temperature of a bucket left in the sun. Hot, almost scalding. The kind of hot that turned skin pink and made muscles unclench and unknot themselves after months of constant tension. Haruka gasped. Her body went rigid with shock. Then slowly she began to relax into the heat, began to let the water do what water was meant to do, wash away the dirt and the fear and the accumulated weight of too many months spent waiting to die. Around her, other women were experiencing their own private resurrections. Some were crying as they washed, their sobs echoing off the tiled walls. Others laughed high and almost hysterical sounds that spoke of minds pushed to the edge of comprehension and beyond. A few simply stood under the water, letting it run over their faces, their hair, their bodies, eyes closed, faces tilted up like flowers seeking the sun. Akemi was at the shower head next to Haruka's. She had her eyes closed, her hands working soap through her hair, her fingers moving slowly as if relearning what it meant to be clean. "I had forgotten," she whispered. The words were barely audible over the sound of running water. "I had forgotten what this felt like." Haruka scrubbed her skin until it turned pink, until she could feel the blood moving beneath the surface, until she looked down and saw the water running gray, and then brown, and finally clear at her feet. Months of dirt swirling down the drain, months of war washing away. She washed her hair 3 times. The first time the soap barely lathered. The second time it foamed a little. The third time it created thick white clouds that smelled like those impossible lilacs, like a world that still had room for beauty, for gentleness, for things that served no purpose except to make life more bearable. When they finally emerged from the showers, they were given clean undergarments, simple gray dresses, soft cotton socks. The fabric was worn but clean, the kind of clean that spoke of soap and sunlight and care. Some women stood in front of mirrors that lined one wall, staring at their own reflections as if seeing strangers. Their skin was pink from the hot water. Their hair, still damp, looked darker and healthier than it had in years. Their faces, though still thin, no longer carried quite the same haunted hollowness. Reiko stood before a mirror, her hand raised to touch her own cheek. "I forgot," she whispered to her reflection. "I forgot I could look like this." But beneath the relief, beneath the unexpected comfort of clean skin and soft fabric, a darker feeling stirred. Confusion, shame, a sense of wrongness that none of them could quite articulate. They were supposed to be suffering. They were supposed to be tortured. The propaganda officer had promised them degradation and pain. Instead, they had been given soap that smelled like flowers and water hot enough to wash away months of accumulated horror. What kind of enemy does this to their prisoners? They were led to a mess hall that could have fit 300 people. Long tables stretched across the room, each one covered with a white cloth. White, as if stains did not exist here. As if the chaos and dirt of war had never touched this place. The smell reached them before they even entered the room. Bread baking, meat cooking, coffee brewing, butter melting. The scent was so rich, so overwhelming, that several women stopped in the doorway, unable to take another step forward. Their bodies knew that smell. Their stomachs clenched with an almost painful hunger at the recognition. But their minds could not process the contradiction. This was enemy territory. This was a prison camp. This smell should not exist here. Please take a seat. The translator's voice was gentle, almost apologetic, as if he understood how difficult this moment was for them. Lunch will be served. The women shuffled to the tables. They sat with backs, rigid, hands folded in their laps like schoolgirls at a formal dinner. They looked at each other with eyes that asked the same question over and over. Is this real? Can this possibly be real? American soldiers in white kitchen uniforms appeared from a door at the back of the hall. They carried large trays moving down the rows with practiced efficiency, placing plates in front of each woman. Haruka looked down at her plate and felt her breath catch in her throat. Roast chicken, golden and glistening with fat, the skin still crackling from the oven. Mashed potatoes with a pool of brown gravy forming a small lake in the center. Green beans bright and fresh, not the gray, overcooked mush that had passed for vegetables in the military. A thick slice of white bread with a pat of yellow butter slowly melting into the warm surface. And beside the plate, a glass of cold milk with condensation beating on the outside. A cup of coffee steam rising from the dark surface carrying the bitter, beautiful smell of roasted beans. She had not seen this much food on one plate in 3 years. In the last year of the war, her daily ration had been a bowl of rice mixed with whatever could be scavenged. Tree bark, sawdust. Sometimes, if they were lucky, a few vegetables that were more stem than substance. Even before the war, even in her father's comfortable middle-class household, she had never eaten like this. This was not a meal. This was abundance. This was America saying through the language of food something that the women could not yet understand. Around her, no one moved. 247 women sat frozen, staring at their plates as if the food might vanish, might reveal itself as an illusion if they reached for it too quickly or believed too strongly in its reality. Please eat. The translator's voice was soft. It is for you. Still no one moved. The seconds stretched into a minute, then 2. The food sat there real and solid and impossibly generous, while women who had been starving for months could not bring themselves to believe in it. Finally, Akemi picked up her fork. Her hand shook so badly the utensil rattled against the plate. She cut a small piece of chicken, the knife sliding through the tender meat with ease. She lifted the fork to her mouth. She chewed slowly, mechanically, her eyes closed as if in prayer. The taste exploded across her tongue. Rich, savory, complex in ways she had forgotten food could be. Fat and salt and the particular sweetness that comes from meat cooked slowly with care. She chewed. She swallowed. And then Akemi Sato, 26 years old veteran of the Philippines campaign, woman who had seen death in 1,000 forms and never flinched, began to cry. That broke the dam. All around her, women started to eat. Some moved slowly, carefully, as if the food were holy and required reverence. Others ate frantically, shoveling food into their mouths with the desperation of people who knew that abundance never lasted, that it could be taken away at any moment. Tears streamed down every face. Some women laughed between bites, the sound high and desperate and joyful. Others ate in silence, their eyes fixed on their plates, their minds unable to process the contradiction between what they had been told and what they were experiencing. Haruka bit into the bread and gasped at the softness. For the last year, bread had meant hard bricks made from sawdust and whatever grain could be stretched far enough to resemble flour. This bread was hearty, white, perfect. It gave beneath her teeth like a cloud might give if clouds could be eaten. She spread butter on it with fingers that trembled so badly she nearly dropped the knife. The butter melted into the warm bread, golden and rich, and when she took another bite, the combination made her dizzy. Across the table, Reika was crying so hard she could not eat. She held a piece of chicken in her hand, just held it, staring at it as if it were an accusation instead of nourishment. "My children," she whispered. "My children are starving in Tokyo and I am eating chicken." The guilt hit all of them at once, a wave that crashed over the momentary joy of full stomachs and warm food. While they sat here eating roast chicken and mashed potatoes, their families were picking through rubble for scraps. Their children were eating grass soup if they were lucky enough to find grass. Their parents were dying of starvation in the ruins of cities that no longer had names because there was nothing left to name. And here they were, the defeated, the prisoners, eating better than they had ever eaten in their lives. The enemy was feeding them better than their own country ever had. Some women pushed their plates away, unable to continue. Others ate everything, driven by a hunger so deep it overrode shame and guilt and every other emotion. A few ate and cried at the same time, tears falling into their mashed potatoes, their bodies unable to choose between relief and anguish. After the meal, they were led to their barracks. They walked in a daze, their bellies full for the first time in months, their minds struggling to process everything that had happened in the space of a few hours. The barracks were simple wooden buildings, painted white with small windows and neat rows inside. But what waited inside those buildings made the women stop in the doorway once again. Beds, not mats on a floor, not piles of straw in a corner. Actual beds with metal frames and mattresses and pillows and folded blankets. Each bed had a small wooden trunk at its foot. The translator explained that they could keep their personal belongings in the trunks, that they could write letters home if they wished, that paper and pencils would be provided. Letters home. They could contact their families. The enemy was going to allow them to send word that they were alive. Haruka chose a bed near a window. She sat down slowly on the mattress, testing its reality with her weight. It was soft, not luxurious, but soft in a way that mattered, in a way that spoke of care and consideration. She pressed her hand into it and watched the fabric give, then spring back when she lifted her hand. She had not slept on a mattress since leaving Japan 2 years earlier. Beside her, Akemi was running her hand over the wool blanket folded at the foot of her bed. "It is thick," she said softly. "It is winter in California, and they gave us thick blankets." Other women were exploring the barracks, opening trunks, testing beds, whispering to each other in voices filled with disbelief and confusion and a growing sense of wrongness. That night, as darkness fell and lights were dimmed to a soft glow, the women lay in their beds wrapped in their warm blankets, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American military base. Trucks rumbling in the distance, soldiers calling to each other in English. The low hum of generators. Outside, crickets chirped. Somewhere, a radio played music soft and jazzy and utterly foreign. Haruka pulled her blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. Her body was warm, her stomach was full. She was clean, she was safe, and she had never felt more confused in her entire life. She thought of the propaganda films she had seen in Japan, the ones that showed Americans as monsters with no souls, no honor, no mercy. She thought of the officers who had told her that surrender meant torture and death. She thought of everything she had believed about the enemy, and then she thought of the soldier who had waved at her on the dock, the nurse who had touched her shoulder with kindness, the chicken on her plate, the soap in her hands that smelled like her mother's garden. Everything she knew was a lie, and that realization was more terrifying than any battle she had ever witnessed. The days took on a rhythm that felt surreal in its ordinariness. Every morning at 6:30, a bell rang across the camp. The sound was gentle and clear, nothing like the harsh alarm clocks that had jolted them awake in military barracks across the Pacific. This bell sounded almost musical, as if designed to wake people who deserved rest, rather than prisoners who deserved nothing. The women rose from their beds, from mattresses that had cradled them through the night, with a comfort so unfamiliar it felt like betrayal. They dressed in their simple gray dresses, made their beds with military precision. Old habits died hard. Even as prisoners, even thousands of miles from Japan, they could not bring themselves to leave a bed unmade, could not abandon the discipline that had been drilled into them since childhood. Breakfast was served at 7 in the mess hall. Oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins. The sweetness was almost painful after months of bland rice gruel. Scrambled eggs, yellow and fluffy, nothing like the few precious eggs that had been rationed one per family per month back home. Toast with jam, strawberry, or grape spread, thick enough that you could taste fruit instead of just the memory of fruit. Fresh apples, oranges, sometimes bananas that had traveled from places these women had never seen and probably never would. Coffee and milk. Every single morning, as if abundance were normal. as if feeding your prisoners well were simply what civilized nations did, nothing special, nothing worthy of comment. Haruka sat at the long table each morning and felt the weight of that abundance pressing down on her chest like a stone. She ate because her body demanded it, because hunger was a physical force that could not be reasoned with or denied. But every bite felt like theft. Every swallow felt like betrayal. After breakfast came work assignments. The translator read names from a clipboard assigning women to various tasks around the camp. Haruka expected brutal labor, expected to be worked until her hands bled, and her back screamed and her legs gave out beneath her. That was what prisoners deserved. That was what happened to the defeated. Instead, she was assigned to the camp hospital. The building was clean and bright, with white walls and floors that smelled of antiseptic and something medicinal she could not identify. She was given simple tasks: folding bandages, organizing supplies, cleaning equipment, work that required care but not strength, attention but not exhaustion. She worked alongside two American nurses. Helen was blonde and warm, perhaps 35 years old, with a smile that reached her eyes and a gentleness in her hands that spoke of genuine compassion rather than duty. Margaret was brunette and more reserved, professional, in a way that felt reassuring, as if competence were its own form of kindness. They did not treat Haruka like a prisoner. They did not watch her with suspicion or speak to her with contempt. They treated her like a colleague, someone who was there to help, rather than someone who needed to be controlled. Helen showed her how to use the equipment, pointing to each instrument and saying its English name slowly, clearly, waiting for Haruka to repeat it back. Scissors, forceps, thermometer, stethoscope. The words felt strange in her mouth, but Helen's patience made them feel less foreign, less impossible to master. Margaret taught her how to organize the supply closet, explaining with gestures in simple English which items needed to be restocked daily and which could wait until the weekly inventory. She showed Haruka where everything belonged, then trusted her to do the work without supervision. Sometimes they shared their lunches with her: a sandwich cut in half, an apple quartered and offered with a smile, a cookie wrapped in wax paper homemade by someone who cared enough to bake for others. These small acts of generosity accumulated like drops of water, filling a cup, each one insignificant alone, but together creating something that threatened to overflow. One afternoon in late September, Helen squeezed Haruka's shoulder and said something in English. The words came slowly, deliberately, as if the nurse wanted to make sure they were understood, even if the language was not. "You are a natural at this. You should be a nurse after the war." The translator passing by in the hallway repeated the words in Japanese. After the war, the phrase hung in the air like smoke. After the war, as if there were an after. As if Haruka had a future beyond this barbed wire, beyond this strange limbo of captivity that felt nothing like captivity at all. As if she were more than just a defeated enemy waiting to be sent home to ruins. Akemi was assigned to translation work. Her English was better than most learned during her time in the Philippines, where she had needed to communicate with local populations and occasionally with American forces during intelligence operations. Now she sat in an office, translating documents, teaching basic Japanese phrases to curious American soldiers who wanted to know how to say hello and thank you and please in the language of their former enemies. The soldiers were young, most of them, boys really not much older than 20, with faces that still carried the uncertainty of youth beneath their military bearing. They asked questions that revealed a curiosity about Japan that surprised her. What is Japan like, they wanted to know. What do people eat there? What kind of music do they listen to? Do Japanese girls really wear those beautiful kimonos we see in pictures? They asked these questions as if Japan were a real place filled with real people, rather than an enemy nation populated by demons and monsters. As if Japanese culture were something worth understanding rather than something to be crushed and forgotten. One soldier showed Akemi a photograph of his girlfriend back home. She had dark hair and a shy smile. He asked if Japanese girls like flowers. He wanted to know if it would be appropriate to send flowers when he proposed marriage. Akemi stared at the photograph and felt something crack inside her. This boy, this American boy whose country had been at war with hers, was asking her for romantic advice, was treating her like a human being who might understand love and courtship and the nervous hope that came with planning a proposal. Reiko was assigned to the camp laundry. Large mechanical washers did most of the work. Great metal drums that tumbled the clothes in hot, soapy water while Reiko and other women loaded and unloaded, folded and sorted. The labor was light, almost gentle. Nothing like the brutal washing she had done in Marapiman, scrubbing uniforms by hand in cold water, her knuckles raw and bleeding her back, bent over a wooden board for hours at a time. Here the machines did the hard work. The women simply guided the process, adding soap, setting timers, moving clean laundry to the drying lines outside, where California sunshine did what sunshine had always done, turned wet fabric into dry. Reiko thought constantly of her children. Were they washing their own clothes now? Were they wearing clean things, or had they been reduced to rags? Did they have soap? Did they have water? Did they have anything at all? Every Friday brought a new impossibility. The women were paid. Each prisoner received a small amount of camp script paper currency that could only be used within the camp, but was real money nonetheless. Payment for their labor. Wages for work performed. Haruka held the bills in her hand and could not process what she was seeing. Prisoners of war being paid for their work. The enemy compensating them for folding bandages and organizing supplies as if their time and effort had value, as if they were employees rather than captives. With this money, they could visit the camp canteen. The canteen was a small store stocked with items that seemed to have been transported from another universe entirely. Chocolate bars lined one shelf, Hershey's, Nestle, Baby Ruth, brands the women had never heard of, wrapped in bright paper that promised sweetness and abundance. The women stood in front of the candy display like pilgrims at a shrine, their eyes wide with wonder and confusion, and a hunger that went deeper than the body, a hunger for the normal pleasures of life that war had stolen from them. Back in Japan, chocolate had disappeared years ago. The last chocolate Haruka had tasted was in 1942, a small square her father had somehow obtained for her 17th birthday. She had made it last for a week, breaking off tiny pieces and letting them melt on her tongue, trying to memorize the taste before it was gone forever. Here, enemy prisoners could buy chocolate bars with wages earned from light labor in a clean hospital. There were other luxuries too: cigarettes for those who smoked, lipstick in shades of red and pink, hand lotion that promised to soften skin roughened by work and weather, pencils and notebooks for those who wanted to write, small bottles of perfume that smelled of flowers and spices, handkerchiefs with embroidered edges, pretty and useless and utterly unnecessary for survival. These were not necessities. These were things that made life more than mere existence, that acknowledged the difference between surviving and living. Akemi bought a chocolate bar on her first visit to the canteen. She carried it back to the barracks like a treasure wrapped in its brown paper, solid and real in her hand. She sat on her bed and unwrapped it slowly, breaking off one square at a time, placing each piece on her tongue and letting it melt there while the other women watched in silence. The sweetness was almost painful. Too much sensation after too long without. The chocolate tasted like childhood, like birthday parties and festivals, like a world where pleasure was normal and expected rather than forbidden and impossible. "I am eating chocolate," Akemi whispered to Haruka. "We are prisoners of war, and I am eating chocolate." She did not need to say the rest. They both understood. Something was wrong here. Something did not match what they had been told, what they had believed, what they had accepted as truth about the nature of war and enemies, and what the defeated deserved. The routine continued through September and into October. Lunch at noon, always hot, always substantial. Meat at nearly every meal, a luxury that would have been unthinkable in wartime Japan. Dinner at 6 with portions generous enough that some women could not finish everything on their plates. Between meals, there were breaks, rest periods, even time for recreation. The Americans had set up a small library in one of the buildings. Shelves held books in Japanese volumes that had been somehow acquired from collections confiscated during the war or donated by Japanese Americans who wanted to help ease the isolation of captivity. The women could check out books, read in their free time, discuss stories with each other as if they were in a reading circle back home rather than a prisoner of war camp in California. On Sundays, there was no work. The women could rest, write letters, or attend religious services if they wished. A Buddhist chaplain visited once a month. Christian services were available every week. The Americans accommodated both, as if the spiritual needs of enemy prisoners mattered, as if faith were a human right rather than a privilege to be granted or withheld. This routine, this strange and gentle rhythm of days, began to wear down their resistance more effectively than any torture could have. Their bodies grew stronger. Color returned to their cheeks, blood moving beneath skin that had been gray with exhaustion and malnutrition. They gained weight, their hollow faces filling out their bones no longer pressing sharp against fabric, their arms and legs developing flesh, instead of just sinew stretched over skeleton. But with physical health came mental turmoil, because every day of comfort was also a day of guilt. Every meal was a reminder that their families were starving. Every bar of chocolate was a betrayal of everyone suffering back home. And yet they could not stop accepting it, could not refuse the food, the warmth, the small kindnesses. They were trapped not by barbed wire, but by the paradox of an enemy who treated them better than their own country ever had. The letters from home arrived in late October. They came in thin envelopes, the paper so fragile it was almost transparent. The handwriting was shaky, written by hands weakened by hunger or age or despair. Each letter had traveled thousands of miles, had been censored and inspected and delayed, but they had arrived, and that arrival changed everything. Haruka's letter came on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in the hospital organizing bandages when the translator found her and handed her the envelope. Her name was written on the front in her mother's familiar script, though the characters were less steady than Haruka remembered, as if the hand that wrote them had been trembling. She sat on her bed that evening and opened it with fingers that shook so badly she almost tore the paper. My dear Haruka, the letter began. We received word that you are alive and a prisoner in America. This brings me both relief and sorrow. Relief that you live, sorrow for what you must endure. Tokyo is gone. Our house is rubble. Your father and I live in a shelter made from sheets of metal scavenged from what used to be a factory. We eat once a day if we are lucky. Today we had rice water and a few leaves of cabbage that I found growing in the ruins of what used to be the Tanaka family garden. Your little brother Kenji grows thinner each week. He is 12 now but looks much younger. He asks about you constantly. He remembers you bringing him sweets before the war. He does not understand why there are no sweets anymore. He does not understand why there is hardly anything. Your father coughs blood. He gives his food ration to Kenji and me. I tell him not to, but he insists. He says he is old and has lived his life, and we are young and must survive. But Haruka, I do not think he will survive much longer. We are alive, and that is enough. I hope you are being treated fairly. I hope you are not suffering too much. We pray for you every night. Your loving mother. Haruka read the letter 3 times. With each reading, her hands shook harder, the paper rustling like leaves in a storm. Then she folded it carefully, precisely, and placed it in her trunk beneath her clean undergarments and her extra pair of socks. That night, she could not eat dinner. She sat in the mess hall and stared at the roast beef and carrots on her plate and saw Kenji's face, 12 years old and starving, asking for sweets that did not exist, growing smaller instead of larger, shrinking as children should never shrink. She saw her father coughing blood, giving away his food, dying slowly so that others might live a little longer. And here she was, gaining weight, her cheeks full, her body strong, eating roast beef while her family scraped metal shelters together from factory ruins and called cabbage leaves a meal. She pushed her plate away and walked back to the barracks. She lay on her soft mattress under her warm blanket and stared at the ceiling and wished that the propaganda had been true. Wished that the Americans had tortured her, had starved her, had given her suffering that made sense instead of this kindness that made no sense at all. All around her, other women were receiving similar letters. Stories of starvation, of homes destroyed, of family members dead or dying. One woman's husband had died of malnutrition. Another's parents had been killed when their neighborhood was firebombed. A third received word that her children had been sent to live with relatives in the countryside because there was no food in the cities, no shelter, no hope. The contrast became unbearable. Here in California, the camp was surrounded by abundance. Beyond the fences, American towns bustled with life. Stores were open, their windows displaying goods that seemed impossible. Food, clothing, household items, luxuries that had no business existing in a world that had just emerged from the largest war in human history. Children played in parks. Families drove cars down clean streets lined with houses that had never been bombed, never been reduced to rubble, never ceased to be homes. Life continued normal and untouched, as if the war had happened on another planet instead of just across an ocean. The women could see it when they were taken outside the camp for work details, One day in early November, a Kimmy was assigned to harvest vegetables in a field beyond the camp perimeter. A dozen women worked under the supervision of an American guard, a middle-aged corporal with kind eyes and weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. At lunchtime, the corporal opened his metal lunchbox. Inside were sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, an apple, a thermos of coffee. He pulled out the sandwiches and began handing them to the women. Not offering, handing, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to share your lunch with enemy prisoners. My wife makes extra, he explained through the translator. She knows you girls are hungry. His wife. A woman he had never met, a woman who knew these prisoners only as abstractions, as enemy nationals, as people her country had been at war with just months earlier. That woman had made extra sandwiches, had wrapped them carefully, had sent them with her husband to be distributed to Japanese women working in a California field, because she thought they might be hungry. Akemi took the sandwich with both hands. Ham and cheese on white bread, the kind of simple meal that had been utterly out of reach for years. She bowed deeply, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak, unable to do anything but hold that sandwich like it was made of gold instead of bread and meat and cheese. That night, she wrote in the journal she had bought at the canteen with her wages. The guard's wife sent sandwiches. She does not know us. We were her enemies. Her country fought ours and people died because of that. But she sent sandwiches. How am I supposed to hate people like this? How am I supposed to remain loyal to an empire that let me starve while the enemy feeds me? I do not know who I am anymore. I do not know what loyalty means. If my country abandoned me and my enemies saved me, who is the villain in this story? The questions had no answers, but they grew louder each day, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Haruka saw herself. She was working in the hospital, organizing supplies in a storage room, when she caught her reflection in a glass cabinet door. For a moment, she did not recognize the woman staring back at her. That woman had round cheeks, clear skin, bright eyes, hair that shone even in the dim light of the storage room. She looked young again, healthy, alive in a way that went beyond mere survival. The hollow, haunted look that had defined Haruka's face for 2 years was gone. The gray pallor of malnutrition had been replaced by the pink glow of adequate food and rest. The dull eyes of someone waiting to had been replaced by the clear gaze of someone who might actually have a future. She looked like she had before the war. No, she looked better than she had before the war. Because even in peacetime, Japan, even in her father's comfortable middle-class household, she had never eaten this well, never had access to this level of medical care, never been this healthy. The enemy had done this. The enemy had restored her to herself, had taken a broken, starving, defeated woman and made her whole again. Haruka's hands began to shake. She braced herself against the cabinet, her breath coming in short gasps, her heart pounding as if she had just run a great distance. Because in that moment, seeing her own healthy reflection, the full weight of the betrayal crashed over her. Not betrayal by the Americans, betrayal by her own country. Japan had taken her youth, her health, her innocence, and used them as fuel for a war machine. Japan had fed her propaganda instead of food, had given her ideology instead of medicine, had demanded her sacrifice while offering nothing in return except more suffering and the hollow promise of honor in death. Japan had told her that suffering was noble, that hunger was honorable, that dying for the emperor was the highest calling a person could answer. All lies, all of it lies designed to make use of her body and her life without having to acknowledge her humanity. Because here she stood, a prisoner of war, healthier and happier than she had ever been as a free citizen of the empire she had been taught to worship. The Americans had not broken her with cruelty. They had broken her with something far more devastating. Truth, the simple, undeniable truth that she was worth feeding, worth caring for, worth treating like a human being who mattered. And that truth demolished everything she thought she knew about loyalty, about honor, about what it meant to serve your country. She slid down to the floor, her back against the cabinet, and sobbed. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sounds that came from somewhere primal and wounded, from a place that had been locked away for years and had finally broken open under the weight of too much contradiction. She cried for the girl she had been, who had believed every word of the propaganda. She cried for the years she had wasted, serving a cause that had never valued her as anything more than a resource to be exploited. She cried for her family still suffering in Japan, still trapped in the lie, still believing that their suffering meant something, when really they were just being used up and discarded. She cried for all the people who had died, believing that their sacrifice mattered, when really they had just been fuel for men who sat in comfortable offices and never missed a meal while sending others to starve and die in jungles and on beaches and in cities that burned under incendiary bombs. Nurse Helen found her there 10 minutes later. The American woman took one look at Haruka's face and seemed to understand without words what was happening. She sat down on the floor beside her, not touching, not trying to fix anything, just sitting there in quiet companionship while Haruka's world fell apart. "It is okay," Helen said softly. The words were in English, but the tone transcended language. "It is okay to be angry. It is okay to feel betrayed. You were lied to. You have every right to grieve for that." Haruka looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. This woman, this American woman whose country had been at war with hers, who had probably lost friends or family to Japanese bullets and bombs, was sitting on a hospital floor offering comfort to an enemy prisoner having a breakdown. And in that moment, Haruka understood something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. This was what democracy looked like. Not the elections and the speeches and the political structures she had read about in banned books, but this simple recognition that every individual had worth regardless of which side of a war they were on. This belief that human rights were not granted by emperors or governments, but simply existed because humans existed. This was the philosophy Japan had been fighting against. The idea that people mattered more than the state, that individuals had value independent of their usefulness to those in power. That dignity was not something to be earned through sacrifice, but something inherent in being human. Japan had lost the war, but more than that, Japan's entire ideology had been proven hollow. Because when you put the two systems side by side, one that treated humans as tools and one that recognized humans as beings with inherent worth, the difference was undeniable. She thought of Kenji in Tokyo starving, while the emperor remained well-fed in his palace. She thought of the American soldier yesterday who had shared his lunch with her. She thought of her father coughing blood while military officers hoarded resources. She thought of the camp commander ordering extra blankets for cold prisoners. The comparison was devastating and undeniable and impossible to unsee once seen. That evening, something shifted in the barracks. Small moments began to accumulate, each one insignificant alone, but together creating a weight that could no longer be ignored. A young soldier had given Akemi a record. Glenn Miller and his orchestra, jazz music bright and brassy and utterly American. He had pressed it into her hands with a smile. "For you," he had said, "for the girls in your barracks." That night, they gathered around the phonograph that had been provided for their recreation and listened to music that should have been the enemy's music, but somehow just sounded like music. Like joy. Like the possibility that beauty could exist even after everything beautiful had been destroyed. Haruka had dropped a stack of linens in the hospital hallway. An American doctor, young and kind, had knelt down to help her pick them up, had treated her clumsiness not as a failure deserving punishment, but as a simple accident that could happen to anyone, had smiled at her and walked away whistling as if helping an enemy prisoner was just part of being a decent person. The camp commander had noticed the cold snap and ordered extra blankets without being asked, had increased coal for the stoves because prisoners might be uncomfortable, had made these decisions as if the comfort of defeated enemies mattered, as if their well-being were his responsibility rather than an afterthought or an inconvenience. These moments accumulated like water filling a vessel, drop by drop. And eventually the vessel overflowed. The women could not maintain their hatred in the face of this relentless humanity, could not cling to propaganda that called Americans demons when those demons kept doing things that demons were not supposed to do, could not remain loyal to an empire that had abandoned them when the enemy was the only thing keeping them alive and whole and human. They were being tortured, not with cruelty, but with kindness. Not with deprivation, but with abundance. Not with degradation, but with dignity. And that torture was breaking them more completely than any physical suffering ever could. Because how do you go back to believing a lie once you have seen the truth? How did you return to a system that treated you as disposable once you have been shown what it feels like to be valued? How do you maintain loyalty to a cause that demanded everything and gave nothing when the enemy has given you back your humanity without asking for anything in return? These questions haunted the barracks at night, and they had no good answers. No answers that let the women sleep peacefully. No answers that made the contradiction bearable. They lay in their soft beds under their warm blankets and stared at ceilings and wondered who they were becoming, who they had been, whether there was any way to reconcile the two. And outside in the California night, crickets sang and radios played jazz, and life continued in its relentless, impossible normalcy, as if the world had not just turned upside down, as if everything they knew had not just been revealed as a carefully constructed lie, as if kindness from your enemy were not the most dangerous weapon of all. November brought the first real cold to California. The women woke one morning to find frost on the windows, delicate patterns of ice that turned glass into lace. Their breath came out in visible clouds. The air in the barracks carried a bite that reminded them of winter mornings in Japan, of cold that seeped into bones and stayed there until spring. They huddled under their blankets, dreading what this cold might mean. In Japan, winter had become a season of death. Fuel was impossible to find. Families burned furniture, books, anything that would produce heat. Children froze in their sleep. The elderly simply did not wake up one morning, their bodies unable to generate enough warmth to sustain life. The women prepared themselves for similar conditions here. This was a prison camp after all. Why would the enemy waste resources keeping prisoners warm? At breakfast, the camp commander made an announcement. He was a tall man in his 50s, his uniform crisp, his bearing military, but not unkind. He spoke through the translator, his voice matter-of-fact, as if what he was saying were completely ordinary. "We have ordered additional blankets and warm coats for all prisoners. They should arrive by next week. In the meantime, we have increased the coal allocation for your stoves. Stay warm." That was all. No ceremony, no expectation of gratitude. Just a simple statement that the command had noticed the temperature dropping and had taken steps to ensure the prisoners would not suffer from it. Reiko sat at breakfast with tears streaming down her face. She made no sound, just let the tears fall into her oatmeal, while the other women pretended not to notice. "They notice when we are cold," she whispered finally to the woman beside her. "The enemy notices when we are cold and brings us blankets." She thought of the winter of 1943 in Hiroshima, before the bomb, when her family had burned the dining table piece by piece to stay warm. Her husband had still been alive, then home on brief leave, and he had taken an axe to the beautiful cherry wood table his grandfather had made. They had burned it in the small stove and huddled around the flames, and her children had cried because they were still cold, because the table was gone, because nothing was enough anymore. The military had requisitioned all the coal. Every ounce of fuel went to the war machine. Citizens could freeze as long as the factories stayed warm. That was the priority. That was what loyalty demanded. And here was the enemy bringing extra blankets because prisoners might be uncomfortable. The debates started that night. They had been whispered about before careful conversations held in the dark after lights out, questions posed in voices so quiet they could be denied if anyone objected. But after the blanket announcement, the whispers became arguments. The questions became demands for answers that no one could provide. Fumiko was the loudest voice of resistance. She was 32, a former translator who had worked in military intelligence. She had believed in the cause with the fervor of someone who needed belief to justify what she had seen and done. She sat on her bed with her arms crossed and her face set in hard lines. "We are still Japanese," she said. Her voice carried across the barracks. "Nothing they do changes who we are. They feed us because the Geneva Convention requires it, not because they care about us. This is all political theater designed to break our spirits. When we return to Japan, we will be judged by how we maintained our dignity in captivity. Every comfort we accept is a betrayal of those who are suffering at home. Every smile we give to our captors is a dishonor to those who died fighting them." Akemi stood up. Her face was flushed, her hands clenched at her sides. "What dignity?" Her voice shook with anger. "We were sent to war by men who promised us victory and glory. They gave us neither. They gave us starvation and defeat. They told us we were fighting for our families and our country, but where were they when we needed food? Where were they when we needed medicine? Where were they when we were dying? Now the enemy feeds us, clothes us, treats us like human beings, and we are supposed to feel ashamed of that. I am done being ashamed. I am done suffering for men who never suffered themselves. Fumiko's face hardened further. You are being brainwashed. This is exactly what they want. To make us forget who we are. To make us grateful to them. To make us complicit in our own defeat. Haruka spoke quietly from her bed by the window. She had not planned to join the debate, but the words came out before she could stop them. Complicit in what the war is over. Japan lost. What exactly are we being complicit in by accepting food and shelter, by not dying of starvation and disease? Is that what honor demands? That we refuse basic human care because it comes from the wrong hands? A young woman named Sachiko stood up. She was only 19, had been a clerk in a medical unit, had seen things no 19-year-old should see. I was taught that Americans had no honor, no respect for human life, no understanding of dignity or shame. But I have seen more respect here than I ever saw in the Imperial Army. I watched officers beat soldiers for minor infractions, watched them send men to certain death and call it glory, watched them take the best food while their troops starved and call it privilege earned by rank. Here I see soldiers who joke with each other, who treat their officers like human beings, who follow orders but do not worship authority blindly. That is not weakness. That is something else, something we were never taught to understand. Reiko spoke next. Her voice carried the weight of age and loss. It is democracy. I read about it before the war in books that were later banned. The idea that people can question authority, that leaders serve the people instead of the other way around, that individual human lives matter more than the glory of the state. I thought it was fantasy, beautiful but impossible. But watching these Americans, seeing how they treat us, how they treat each other, I think maybe it is real. Maybe this is what a country looks like when it believes that human dignity is not something granted by the government, but something inherent in being human. Fumiko stood up, her face twisted with something between anger and desperation. Democracy did not stop them from dropping atomic bombs on our cities. Democracy did not stop them from firebombing Tokyo and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, most of them women and children who had nothing to do with the war. Do not romanticize them just because they are nice to us now. Silence fell over the barracks, because Fumiko was right and everyone knew it. The same country that gave them soap that smelled like lilacs had also unleashed destruction on a scale that defied comprehension. The same hands that handed out chocolate bars had pushed buttons that sent fire from the sky. The same system that protected prisoner rights had incinerated cities full of people who never held a weapon. How could both things be true? Akemi spoke slowly, thinking through each word. Maybe that is what makes them powerful. They can do both. They can destroy their enemies completely and then treat the survivors with mercy. That is not a contradiction. That is a kind of strength we were never taught to recognize. Japan taught us that strength is unwavering loyalty, unquestioning obedience, willingness to die without complaint. But maybe real strength is being able to show mercy after you have won. Maybe real power is treating your defeated enemy with dignity instead of cruelty. That is terrifying because it means they are not the demons we were told about. It means they are something more complicated, more human. And if they are human, then everything we believed about this war, about our enemies, about what we were fighting for might be wrong. The conversations continued night after night, never reaching resolution. Some women stopped participating, retreated into silence, unwilling to confront questions that had no comfortable answers. Others became obsessed, arguing for hours as if finding the right words could somehow make sense of the senseless. But beneath all the arguments, beneath all the philosophical wrestling, was a simple and devastating truth that every woman felt but few could articulate. They had been lied to, about the enemy, about the war, about what loyalty and honor meant. And those lies had cost them everything: their homes, their families, their sense of who they were. And now they were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered worldview and try to build something new from the rubble. December brought Christmas. The Americans began decorating a large tree in the recreation hall. The women watched through windows as soldiers strung lights and hung ornaments and placed a star on top. They had never seen anything like it. In Japan, Christmas was barely acknowledged a foreign holiday that had no place in their culture. But here it seemed to be something important, Something worth celebrating even in a prisoner of war camp thousands of miles from home. The commander announced that all prisoners were invited to a Christmas party. There would be special food, music, entertainment, and gifts. Gifts for prisoners of war. Most of the women attended out of curiosity. They sat in rows of chairs in the decorated hall and watched American soldiers perform skits and songs. The entertainment was clearly meant to be funny, though the humor often did not translate. But the effort was unmistakable. These men were putting on a show for enemy prisoners, trying to bring some joy into a barracks on Christmas, trying to share something of their culture and their celebration. Then came the moment that changed everything. Soldiers brought out bombs wrapped in bright paper. They called names and handed each woman a small package. The packages were light, nothing extravagant, but they were wrapped with care with ribbon and bows, as if the contents mattered, as if the recipients mattered. Haruka opened hers with hands that trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. Inside was a bar of soap, a comb, a small mirror, a chocolate bar. Simple things, practical things, but wrapped like Christmas presents, given with no expectation of anything in return, offered because it was Christmas. And giving gifts at Christmas was what Americans did even to their enemies. She stared at the items in her lap and felt something break open inside her. Not break painfully, but break like a seed cracks open to allow new growth. Break like ice melts in spring to let water flow again. These were not lavish gifts designed to buy loyalty. These were not strategic offerings calculated to win cooperation. These were just human. One human giving another human something small and kind because it was a holiday that celebrated generosity and peace and goodwill toward all people, even enemy people, even defeated people, even people who had been trying to kill you just months earlier. That was when Haruka understood what she was really seeing. The Americans were not treating them well because some treaty required it. They were not following rules out of fear of punishment or hope of reward. They were doing it because this was simply how they treated people. This was their default, their baseline, their understanding of what it meant to be civilized. Even in war, even with enemies, even when they had every right to hate. This was American power, not just the bombs and the ships and the factories, but this belief that every person had value, that even your enemy deserved basic dignity, that victory did not require cruelty, that you could win a war and still maintain your humanity. This was the ideology Japan had been fighting against, the idea that individuals mattered more than the collective, that human rights existed independent of what your government said, that dignity was inherent in being human, not something earned through service or sacrifice or blind obedience. And it worked. It was working on them right now. Every meal, every blanket, every small kindness, all of it was a demonstration that there was another way to organize society, another way to think about what people deserved and why. Around her, other women were opening their gifts. Some cried quietly, others stared at what they had received with expressions of wonder and confusion and grief. A few smiled genuine smiles that reached their eyes, the first real smiles many of them had worn since the war began. Reiko stood up slowly. She walked to the front of the hall, her small package clutched in her hands. She stopped in front of the American commander and bowed deeply, the formal bow of profound respect and gratitude. The translator stepped forward. She says, "Thank you," he relayed. "Thank you for treating us like human beings. We did not expect this. We were taught to expect cruelty, but you have shown us something different, something we do not fully understand yet, but we are grateful." The commander looked uncomfortable, his face flushed slightly. He shifted his weight from foot to foot. "We are just following the rules, ma'am. The Geneva Convention requires proper treatment of prisoners of war. We are not doing anything special." But they were. They absolutely were. Following rules that protected even your enemies. Treating prisoners with dignity even when your own people had died at their hands. Choosing mercy when you could choose vengeance. Celebrating Christmas with people who had been trying to kill your brothers and sons and husbands just months before. That was everything. That was the whole point. As the party continued, something shifted in the collective heart of those 247 women. The hardliners became fewer. The debates became quieter. and exhaustion settled over them, the exhaustion of resistance finally crumbling under relentless proof that everything they had believed was wrong. They could not maintain their hatred in the face of this persistent humanity, could not cling to propaganda when the evidence against it accumulated with every passing day, could not remain loyal to an empire that had abandoned them when the enemy was demonstrating what real loyalty looked like, loyalty to principles rather than to power. Winter turned slowly to spring. Rumors began circulating through the camp in March. Ships were being prepared. Arrangements were being made with the Japanese government. Soon the women would be repatriated, sent back to Japan, returned to their families and their country. The news should have brought joy. They were going home, back to everything familiar, back to the people they loved, back to the culture they understood. This was what they had been waiting for since the day they were captured. But instead of joy, most of the women felt a deep and terrible dread. Haruka lay awake at night and tried to imagine returning to Tokyo. Her mother's letters painted a picture of devastation that seemed to worsen with each new message. The city was ruins. Food was desperately scarce. Disease was spreading through the overcrowded shelters. Her father was dying slowly of tuberculosis, giving away his rations so others might live. And she would return to that nightmare healthy and well-fed, with flesh on her bones and color in her cheeks, with strength in her body and clarity in her mind. How would she explain that to her starving family? How would she look her little brother Kenji in his hollow eyes and tell him she had been eating roast chicken and chocolate while he foraged for weeds and boiled tree bark for soup? How would she watch her father die, knowing that she had been given medical care in an American hospital while he coughed blood in a metal shack with no medicine, no doctor, no hope? One evening, Akemi spoke the words they were all thinking. "I am afraid to go back." Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the silent barracks. What kind of person does that make me? Japan is my home. My family is there. Everything I know is there. But the thought of leaving here, of giving up the food and the safety and the... She could not finish, could not say the word that hovered unspoken. Dignity. The thought of giving up the dignity of being treated like a human being who mattered. Reiko answered what they were all feeling. We feel guilty because this camp, this prison has been kinder to us than our own country ever was. And that is not something we can say out loud without sounding like traitors. But it is true, and we have to live with that truth for the rest of our lives. April 1946 arrived cold and gray. The women boarded ships at the same pier where they had disembarked 7 months earlier. They stood on deck watching San Francisco Bay recede behind them, watching the Golden Gate Bridge shrink on the horizon, watching America disappear into the distance. Many cried. Some waved to the American guards who had come to see them off, men who had spent months watching over them, feeding them, treating them with a casual respect that still felt miraculous. The journey across the Pacific took 3 weeks. The conditions were not as comfortable as the camp. The ships were crowded and the seas were rough, but they were fed regularly, treated with basic dignity. Nothing like the nightmare voyages of the war years when prisoners had been packed into holds like cargo and left to die of thirst and starvation. When the Japanese coast finally appeared on the horizon, the women crowded the rails. They strained to see their homeland after years away. What they saw made hearts sink and stomachs clench with horror. Devastation. Complete and total devastation. Cities reduced to ash and rubble. Harbors choked with the skeletal remains of ships maimed and marred and sunk. Coastlines scarred by bombardment. Forests burned to blackened stumps. Everything familiar made unrecognizable by the machinery of total war. They sailed past what had been Hiroshima. The atomic bomb's damage was visible even from the water. An entire city simply erased, flattened, turned to dust and shadow. Where hundreds of thousands of people had lived there was now just emptiness, silence, death on a scale that the human mind could not fully comprehend. They docked at Yokohama. The reality of what awaited them crashed down with crushing weight. Buildings reduced to skeletal frames. Streets lined with rubble. People in rags picking through debris like scavengers. Children with swollen bellies and stick-thin limbs begging for food. Women selling anything they had clothing. Family heirlooms, their own bodies, anything for a handful of rice or a piece of bread. This was home. This was what they were returning to. Haruka stepped off the ship onto Japanese soil and felt no joy. Around her, other women were crying not with happiness, but with horror at what their country had become. They were processed through a repatriation center and given minimal supplies. A small amount of yen that inflation had made nearly worthless. A travel permit. Directions to find transportation if any still existed. Then they were released to find their own way to whatever remained of their families. Haruka boarded a train to Tokyo. The train was crowded beyond capacity, people packed into cars designed for half as many clinging to the outside riding on the roof. The landscape rolled past the windows like a nightmare. Burned forests, collapsed bridges, towns that had simply ceased to exist. She found her family in a shelter constructed from scavenged sheet metal in what had once been a prosperous neighborhood. Now it was a field of makeshift structures inhabited by ghosts of people who had once been citizens of an empire. Her mother had aged decades. Her hair was white. Her face was nothing but skin stretched over bone. Her eyes were huge and her gaunt face burning with something between hope and accusation. Her father was dying. The tuberculosis had advanced too far. He could barely sit up. His cough brought up blood that he tried to hide in a rag, not wanting to frighten anyone with how bad it had become. Kenji was 12 now, but looked 8. Malnutrition had stunted his growth. His legs were thin as sticks. His belly was distended from eating things that were not really food. His eyes were old-aged by suffering no child should know. When they saw Haruka, their first expressions were joy. Pure and simple joy that she was alive. But that joy faded quickly as they took in her appearance. Her healthy weight, her clear skin, her strong body that spoke of months of adequate food and rest and medical care. "You look well," her mother said carefully. The words carried layers of meaning. "The Americans treated you well." Haruka nodded. She could not speak. Tears streamed down her face in rivers, because she understood everything her mother was not saying. "You were eating while we starved. You were safe while we died slowly in the ruins. You were with the enemy while we lost everything." Kenji stared at her. He did not run to embrace her. He just stared as if she were a stranger, as if she were a ghost from some other world that he could not quite recognize or understand. That night, the family shared a meal. Thin rice gruel made from ration grain mixed with water to stretch it further. A few pickled vegetables that were more salt than substance. Haruka could barely swallow. Every spoonful stuck in her throat. She kept thinking of roast chicken and mashed potatoes and chocolate bars and bread so soft it melted on your tongue. She wanted to vomit from the guilt. Years passed. Japan rebuilt itself through sheer force of will and American aid. The occupation brought democracy and constitutional reform and a flood of resources to help the country rise from ashes. Cities grew from ruins. The economy began to recover. Life slowly and painfully returned to something approaching normal. The women who had been prisoners scattered across the country. Most never spoke publicly about their experiences. The shame was too deep. The contradictions too painful. But they were changed. Fundamentally and irrevocably changed. Haruka became a nurse. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to healing others. In the 1960s, she opened a small clinic in Tokyo where she treated patients with a philosophy learned in an American prison camp. Every person, regardless of status or background or ability to pay, deserved dignity and care. She kept her American nursing textbooks, the ones Helen had given her, as a parting gift. Sometimes when the clinic was quiet, she would flip through them and remember the woman who had sat with her on a hospital floor while her world fell apart. Akemi married an American soldier during the occupation. It scandalized her family, but she did not care. She had learned that love and kindness mattered more than national pride or cultural purity. She moved to California and raised 3 children who grew up speaking both languages, comfortable in both cultures, proof that identity could be complex and beautiful precisely because it refused to be singular. Reiko returned to her children and spent the rest of her life teaching them what she had learned. That propaganda was dangerous. That questioning authority was necessary. That their worth as human beings came from their humanity itself, not from their service to any state or emperor or system. Most of the women never spoke publicly about what had happened to them. But in private conversations with daughters and granddaughters, they passed on what they knew. Question everything. Think critically. Recognize propaganda when you see it. The enemy is not always who you are told it is. Sometimes the people who treat you with the most humanity are the ones you least expect. In 1997, Haruka gave a rare interview to a Japanese television program. She was 74 years old, her hair white, her hands marked by decades of nursing work. The interviewer asked the question everyone wanted to know. So the Americans were good to you? Haruka shook her head slowly. It is not that simple. They dropped atomic bombs on our cities. They killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. They were capable of terrible, terrible things. I do not forget that. I will never forget that. She paused and looked out the window at modern Tokyo, all glass and steel and prosperity built on the ashes of the old. But they were also capable of mercy, of treating their enemies with dignity. And that mercy changed me more than any punishment could have. It made me question everything I had been taught. And those questions led me to truth, painful truth, but truth nonetheless. The interviewer leaned forward. What truth? That human dignity transcends borders and ideologies. That propaganda is always a lie, no matter who speaks it. That the real measure of a society is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies when it has the power to destroy them. She smiled sadly. I spent my whole life trying to pass on what I learned. These lessons cost me everything I once believed, but they gave me something more valuable. The ability to see clearly, the courage to question, the understanding that kindness is not weakness, but the truest form of strength. Haruka died in 2003 at the age of 80. But before she died, she said something to her niece that the younger woman never forgot. The soap that smelled like lilacs, the chocolate bar, the clean sheets and warm blankets. They were not just physical objects. They were proof that everything we had been taught was a lie. They were proof that the enemy could show mercy, that dignity is more powerful than cruelty, that sometimes the hardest thing to carry is not hatred but kindness from those you expected to hate you. She leaned forward, her old eyes burning with intensity. Never forget this. The most dangerous weapon is not a bomb. It is an idea. The idea that every human life has value, even enemy lives, even the lives of people who tried to kill you. That is what broke us. That is what saved us. And that is what you must remember when the next war comes. Because there is always a next war. And there is always propaganda telling you who to hate. Your job is to remember that the enemy is human too. This is the story of 247 women who learned that truth the hard way, who discovered that their real enemy was not the Americans who fed them, but the lies they had been told about who deserved dignity and who deserved destruction. It is a story about the most dangerous weapon America possessed in 1945. Not the atomic bomb that ended the war, but the simple, radical belief that every person matters, that human rights transcend nationality, that you can destroy your enemy on the battlefield and still treat them like human beings afterward. That kindness offered without expectation of return, without calculation of advantage, without any motive except the belief that it is the right thing to do, is more powerful than any weapon ever devised. The women who experienced that kindness carried its lesson for the rest of their lives. They passed it on to their children and grandchildren. They taught the next generation to question, to think critically, to recognize when they were being lied to about who their enemies really were. And in doing so, they ensured that the most important victory of World War II was not won on any battlefield. It was won in a prison camp in California, where defeated enemies were given soap that smelled like flowers and taught that human dignity could survive even the worst that war could do. That lesson echoes still, in every act of mercy shown to the defeated, in every choice to treat enemies as humans rather than monsters, in every moment when someone with power chooses kindness over cruelty. The chocolate and the soap and the warm blankets were never just about comfort. They were about proving that another way was possible, that strength did not require brutality, that victory did not demand vengeance, that the truest measure of greatness is not in how completely you can destroy your enemies, but in how much humanity you can maintain even when you have every right to lose it. 247 women learned that lesson. And their story, their testimony, their transformed lives stand as proof that it was true. Kindness is not weakness. It is the most powerful weapon we have, and it always will be.